Nathanael is a skeptic. I'm not sure about this whole faith thing. He only mildly listens. That's who we're going to study today, Nathanael. Over the next 9 weeks after today, we're going to look at 10 encounters with Jesus. When Jesus talked to people, what was he trying to do? He was relating to them. He was trying to love them. He was trying to give them truth, trying to move them towards God. And each of these stories we're going to look at, there are some fascinating nuggets about how he relates to us and how he wants us to relate to him. Most of the time, skeptics, and I was one my first few years in college, are interested in the big questions of life. Why are we here? Is there a God? Is there a purpose to life? Is there really absolute morals, absolute law? And down through the course of history, different people have come up with different answers to those. Some of the ancients, some of the Greek mythology or the Norse mythology, in general, had their big idea was that what drove the universe was power. That was what was most important. And the message was to focus on power, taking control of life. That's where you find life. In our modern day, and in times past, our secular culture believes there is no God. And because there's no God, there was really nothing outside of our human experience that tells us that there is a purpose to life. There's no absolute truth or absolute morality. It just sort of, you are left to sort of make up your own purpose, invent your own purpose and your own set of morals. That sounds like a very open-minded approach to life, but it's impossible to live that way. Just before World War II, the English secular philosophers and thinkers were in this school, and they thought they were driving ahead on a good road, but they came across something they never anticipated. As Nazi Germany was on the rise, Germany was the most well-educated culture in the history of our world. And yet the Germans had the same belief about that there was no absolute morality. There was no God, that we were left to use our reason to make the most of this life and this purpose. Our current culture would say it this way: what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. Sounds like an open-minded thing. But the English were quite perplexed about this because they could see what Germany was doing in Eastern Europe to nations, gobbling them up, and peoples, incarcerating them, enslaving them. And yet when they tried to say something about that, the Germans said, what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for us is true for us. There is no absolute right and wrong. The English philosophers, though they espoused that there was no absolute right and wrong, were caught in the horns of their own dilemma. They were appealing to some standard of right and wrong to say that what Hitler was doing and Germany was doing was wrong. That's sort of the second group, secular thought. So, whereas you might think of the mythology and the ancients and animus as power is the key word, for secular thought, I think of the word as prose. You write your own purpose. You write your own morality, your own truth. The third one has been around a long time started with the Greeks. And the Greeks thought of life as it's something to use your reason, and there's a rational view of life. There's a morality, there's an ethic, there's a right way of living that you can use your reason with. So if the first group thought of power as the key word, and the secular thought, I think of the word prose, write your own, this third group, I would use the word principle. There are principles that you can use your reason to find out that helps govern life, answers the big questions of life. The Greeks used a Greek word called logos, which we think of as word, but it was a bigger word than that. It meant reason, or the explanation. The Apostle John comes along and he picks up on that same word, logos, and he uses that same word to describe the answers to the big questions of life, but with a different word. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word. So You know, when you're first reading this, you think, what's that word thing? What does it mean by word? Well, all he does, he sort of brings us in a little bit by a little bit. In the beginning was the Word. So something way back in time. And the Word was with God. Whatever this word thing is, it was way back there in time with God, number 2. Number 3, and the Word was God. Ooh. Some kind of connection there. Verse 2. He was with God. Not a principle, not a power, not a program, a person. A person. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, creation. Without him nothing was made that was made. Verse 14, and the Word became flesh. We call this the incarnation. And dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. We'll see this in our series. Truth to people, but at the same time, when we don't live our truth, there's grace offered. Grace and truth. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, reflective of who God is. That means one and only. Who came from the Father, and then he repeats, full of grace and truth. If the ancients thought of the one word to describe the driver of life, if they used the word power, and secular thought, I would use the word pros, write your own. And the Greeks thought of what would organize life or answer the questions, the word principle. What the gospel would say is it's a person. The idea is you're not going to find the great answers to life by sitting down and navel-gazing and trying to figure this out on your own. The way to the answers to the big questions of life has to do with relating to someone, to an encounter with God himself who has come in the flesh. And that's what we're going to see today in our first story with Nathanael. When you're a skeptic, as I was my first few years in college, I liked to think of myself as an open-minded person. But in retrospect, when I look back on my several years as a skeptic, I was open-minded about the things I wanted to be open-minded about, and I was very closed-minded to the things that I did not want to be open to, which we'll see in our story today with Nathanael. Now, a little brief background. Rabbis and teachers, somebody like John the Baptist, would have disciples. These were usually young adults that were walking around with them and sort of doing life together, listening to their teaching, what they had to say, and watching how they related to people. And they learned about life by doing this. And John the Baptist had his own group of disciples, his followers, and he'd been telling them about a coming Messiah, about the Old Testament prophecies and what the Messiah is going to look like. And then one day, the Messiah shows up. And John, in verse 29 of chapter 1, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." The sacrificial lamb prophesied about centuries and centuries before in the law of Moses, through all the history of Israel, and then through the prophecies. The one that can take away the sin of the world, not through just a little lamb on Saturday in the temple, but the one who can take away the sin of mankind for all time. He has arrived. Verse 43. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee, which was a neighboring territory to the north. Finding Philip, he said to him, this is one of John the Baptist's disciples, "Follow me. I'm getting ready to leave town. I'm going north to Galilee," and this is the call of discipleship. We don't just come to listen to what God has to say in his word and then go home and do what we want to. This is the call to follow what he says, to follow his teaching. It's to enter into a relationship with him of love and loyalty. He's getting ready to leave town. He says, "Follow me." Verse 44, Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael, who's our fellow back here, the skeptic, and told him, "We have found the one Moses," which was the first 5 books of the Old Testament, wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets, the major prophets and minor prophets, over hundreds and hundreds of years, also wrote about, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Now, what he's just told Nathanael is something that is so amazing. The math on this is pretty wild. What are the odds of all of these prophecies coming down into one particular person? Even if you just take the top 60 major prophecies, it's astronomical. One fellow illustrated it this way. If you were to take a silver dollar and throw it into the middle of Texas somewhere, and to cover the whole state of Texas with quarters about 3 feet deep, the likelihood of finding that silver quarter is the same likelihood of one fellow being the one that 60 of these major prophecies combined into one fellow. These guys have been studying this for a while. And they say to Nathanael, you've got to come. I mean, this is an astounding thing. Now, notice Nathanael's response. Nazareth, he says, can anything good from there? Nathanael asked. Now, with one quick swoop, he dismissed Jesus Christ and all the prophecies because of one small item. Nazareth. Now, if he could have been a snob or he could have been a bigot. If he was a snob, he would have been like what my mother talked about, those people on the other side of the tracks. In my mother's world, it was the other people that were on the other side of the tracks, not us. I didn't know that until after I left home. Or he could have been a bigot. He could have looked at the people in Galilee where Nazareth was and says, those people used to be of the Jewish heritage. They sold out to the pagans a long time ago, intermarried, and they've lost the entire Jewish culture. But either way, he used contempt over some small thing to dismiss the big thing. Contempt. Instead of being intellectually honest about what had just been shared with him. Really, prophecies, Moses, thousands of years, testimony. But he didn't do that. It's easy to be dismissive. And to be dismissive so quickly is deadly. Think about this. Nathanael almost dismissed Jesus Christ through a small amount of contempt and the wonder of what his life could become through Jesus Christ. This is not true just of Nathanael. God had this problem with the people when they came out from the Exodus. In Numbers 14, the Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt?" It's the same thing. How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the miraculous signs I have performed among them? Years ago, let's go to the next slide. Years ago, Mindy and I, when we were first married, were doing student work at TCU, University in Fort Worth. And I remember meeting through the course of the year about 20 freshman students where I had some good discussions with, and would ask them, have you ever studied the claims of Christ? And for the most part, just without exception, every one of these guys said, I don't believe in that stuff. Really? I'd say. How did you come to that conclusion? I would ask. And virtually every one of those guys, no one had done any study of the Gospels of who Jesus Christ was. They had a caricature of him, not the real him, but a caricature, and they dismissed the caricature with contempt, just like Nathanael had done here. I asked them, how much research did you do before you came to that conclusion? Read the Gospel of John? Maybe 3 chapters of the book of John. Not one guy had done any personal investigation. And so I asked them, if you did as much research on your term papers as you did on this topic, what kind of grade would you get? And everybody chuckled. But the point was made. They'd drawn an erroneous conclusion without doing hardly any investigation, while at the same time feeling intellectually superior without any intellectual investigation. Now, how does Philip respond to this, to Nathanael's Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? I love what Philip says. He says, Come and see. You don't have to believe me. You don't have to listen to me. Listen to him. Check it out for yourself is the idea. See, it's one thing if you're a skeptic, and I was a skeptic again for a couple of years, and I did this, to bluster about the things, the answers that Christianity says I don't believe in about the big questions of life. It's one thing to bluster about that. But it's another thing to say, well, if I don't believe those answers, what answers do I believe? That's another step. And that requires some intellectual honesty. Cynicism is not an answer for contempt. That's not intellectually honest. Now, one of the things that's true of Philip, the skeptic, and was true of me, my junior year in college, was it's not just that I am skeptical in my head about certain things that I'm thinking about, or about claims about God or about Jesus, but in addition, there's an inner hunger that God has built into every one of us, a spiritual hunger. Now, all of us as human beings like to tamp that thing down and try to avoid it. We just don't see it as that important, not worthwhile, not valuable. And yet, that hunger is still like an engine humming along, inescapable. And at different times, we become sort of aware of that hunger when the things that we're using to fill ourselves aren't working that well. A marriage or parenting, a job, finances, all kinds of things. But that hunger is still there. If we think that the answers to life will come from within inside of me, I really don't need anything outside of me, you will be plagued with doubt about the answers you come up with. You cannot satisfy big questions from within. We're not made that way. How does the skeptic find faith? He finds faith at the end in a very personal way. I love what happens here. He had been contemptuous of Jesus, and we don't have all the, in this story particularly, we don't have all the details, but we do have enough details to speculate on what's going on inside of Nathanael. Have you ever been talking with someone, and you ended up talking about a third person, and you said something disparaging about that third person that you thought was not going to be shared, but ended up being shared with a third person? I've done that. It's not pleasant. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. You feel like an idiot, a moron. And there has to be something, some relationship building back. Trust has been violated. If you've done that and you know about that, what do you anticipate you're going to get from the person that you talk bad about? A lecture? Maybe. A scolding? Maybe. Do. A time of coldness, perhaps. Jesus knows Nathanael has been talking bad about him behind his back. And the two of them finally meet. Verse 47. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, this is Nathanael our skeptic, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false." Now, if you know that you've been a scoundrel to a third party, and suddenly that third party is standing in front of you and speaking kindly to you, what goes on inside of you? The thing that goes on inside of my mind is I'm sort of dumbfounded. I think they know that I did that, and yet they're still being kind to me when they have every right in the world to dismiss me and tell me where to take a flying leap. Who is like that? Who responds with kindness like that? Most of the time, we'd be hard-pressed to think of anyone. One of my favorite people in American history is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was mostly venerated during the South, during the time of the Civil War, but he did have his critics and detractors, and one particular fellow was very outspoken about his public criticism of Robert E. Lee. And he went to a Richmond Examiner reporter came to Lee one day and asked him, what do you think about so-and-so? The man who had very publicly scolded Robert E. Lee in the press, where everybody in Richmond knew about this. And Robert E. Lee said some very flattering things about the man. And the reporter from the Richmond Examiner was dumbfounded. He said, "How can you say something like that after what he said about you?" And Lee said to him, "You asked me what I thought about him, not what he thought about me." That's something of what's going on here with Jesus and Nathanael. Nathanael is dumbfounded by this. And he asked him the question to Jesus, "How do you know me?" This is one of those things our teenagers would say, awkward. Feeling exposed. And yet I'm not getting the scolding or the coldness or the lecture that I'm due. You're still being kind. Jesus answers, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Now, this is where we really don't know any of the details about what he just says here. But it's enough. All we need to know is it stops Nathanael in his tracks a second time. Because this man standing in front of him not only knows what he's thinking and saying, but he also knows what I do, even when he's not around. His mind is spinning about 1,000 miles an hour. He's thinking about what Philip and Andrew and Peter had been witnessing to him about, and he had dismissed. He's thinking about now the man in front of him, Jesus, and what he's hearing. And instead of scolding him and lecturing him like it was due, he's being kind to him, and he's seeing this man is not just a man. There really is something miraculous about this man. I don't know what it is, but the testimony of his friends was corroborated in his head. I remember the night I became a Christian. My mind was spinning 1,000 miles an hour as well. I was 20 years old, and I was thinking, how could I have missed this Jesus thing growing up in a church? All these other students have this inner joy and this inner peace that just comes from the inside and radiates out of them. I don't have that. How could I have missed that? My mind was whizzing around. I was thinking about, man, I've lived 20 years of my life. I could live another 20 years on the same track I'm going and still miss that. I have no guarantee that that inner peace and inner joy those students have found in Jesus Christ I'll ever find in anything out in my outside world. And I was like Nathanael. I was encountering Jesus, and he was encountering me. Then Nathanael declared, verse 49, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus said to him, "You believe because I told you, I saw you under the fig tree. You shall see greater things than that." He says to him, well, it's good you've come to faith. You've come to faith on the backs of your friends and their faith, but now you started. But you're just in the infant stage of your faith. You're not at the end of this journey. You're just at the beginning of your faith journey. Another famous skeptic, probably more so than Nathanael, is a man by the name of Thomas. Thomas was one of the disciples, walked around with Jesus for 3.5 years. And after the resurrection, the other disciples had seen the risen Christ. Thomas had not, and he was not a believer in that. He thought it was a bunch of hocus pocus. Verse 24 of John. Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Skeptic. A little while later, these guys are in the same room. Jesus shows up. If you were Thomas, what would you expect? I'd probably expect Jesus to walk over and say to me, "How dare you? After all I've done for you for 3.5 years, given you my life, taught you everything I know, pointed you to the Father. You know that cross thing that happened a few days ago? That was partly for you." That's not what Jesus does. He encounters doubting Thomas. And he says very simply, "Put your finger into my hand. Put your hand in my side." Stop doubting. Start believing. It's not just that he's giving him evidence of the resurrection, but how he relates to Thomas is stunning to him. And he says, "My Lord and my God." Because who relates like that? Who loves me like that? Even when I've been a complete moron. The last thing, as I think about, the last thing he says, verse 51, that he tells Nathanael. He says, "I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Son of Man is a nickname or biblical name for him. It's a name related to deity, which he's saying to himself. But what is this whole thing? Heaven open, angels of God ascending and descending on me. And Nathanael was a product of his Jewish culture. This was a story not unfamiliar to him. It's called Jacob's Ladder. And about 2,000 years before, the patriarch Jacob was in a tight spot. He went to sleep at night, and God gave him a vision. And in that vision, in a dream, he could see that the heavens opened. I think about clouds parting. This ladder comes down to where he is. And in his dream, he's watching angels coming down and angels going up. When he wakes up the next morning, he realizes that God is in that place. And that God is going to walk him through his very tough situation. Why would Jesus pull this story out of all the Old Testament stories he could have to encourage Nathanael with his baby faith? I think he tells this story to him for this reason. Nathanael, you may think you've been at the end of a long journey of skepticism. Well, you have. And that you're ending your journey of faith. No. You're just beginning. And what you know of me right now is good, and it's enough to sort of get you in the front door, but there's a whole lot more you're going to learn as time goes on about me. And the picture that he gives them is a picture of the incarnation. Of God looking down at humanity and the mess that we make of things through our own sin, and that God is not a hands-off kind of thing. He sends a ladder down and he sends his Son down. Angels are a picture of royalty. The Son comes down the ladder himself into our dark world. God himself, God in the flesh, the incarnation. And he's going to help Nathanael walk back up that ladder and take some people with him before he's done. It's as if he's saying to him, we've just begun. And what I'm going to build into your life and into your character over the course of your lifetime, you're going to be amazed at. You're going to become a different person little by little. And if you live long enough, there's going to be some of you that shines like I do. It's a great picture. 41 years ago, as Doug mentioned, I became a Christian. That night, with my mind spinning 1,000 miles an hour, I knew just enough about Jesus to be in the door. He died for my sin. I was a sinner. He was the Lord. I needed a Lord. That's about all I knew. Now, 40 years later, I know a whole lot more about him. And my heart is filled with wonder at what he's doing in me and what he wants to do in us. A skeptic. Contempt. Mocking. Caricature. Not good enough. My wife is a kindergarten teacher. There was a little kindergartner, not in her class, named Jeffrey. Jeffrey was sitting in the middle of his class, 5-year-old, when he suddenly felt something warm and wet. He looked down, and he was mortified. He had peed in his pants. There was no escaping this. He looked down. The first drop had landed on the tile floor. He knew it would happen within just a matter of minutes. He would be ridiculed mercilessly. He looked up, and the teacher seemed to notice the same thing. And she was making her way to his aisle and was starting to come down the aisle What he didn't see was that behind him, there was another girl in the class, Sally, who was walking up with a plastic goldfish bowl filled with water. And as she got up next to him, she inadvertently tripped, and the whole water in the goldfish bowl fell into his lap and doused him. And everybody immediately started bagging on Sally. Ha ha, Sally, ah, what a klutz. Hey, you can't even walk out with a bowl of water. You know how kids are. Filled with contempt and ridicule. And Sally took it. Nobody knew that he peed in his pants. Teacher went and got 2 gym shorts, and he went and changed wore the 2 gym shorts until his jeans could dry. And then it was time for it, and the teacher got a towel, mopped up everything. Well, it's time to go to recess, and everybody left. That is, everybody except Jeffrey and Sally. Jeffrey looked back, and Sally was sitting there. And he got up and he said, "You did that on purpose, didn't you?" And she said, "Yes." She said, I've peed in my pants before. And you know what happens when somebody does that in this class. And I didn't want you to have to go through any of that. This is something of what Jesus Christ did for us. He didn't want us to go through the punishment that was due us or any of the shame that was due us. He took all of that upon himself. Let's pray together. Father, it's easy to be a skeptic. It's a lot harder to actually come up with answers. And sometimes we torpedo ourselves by contempt or using a caricature of something you're not, and then dismissing not just the message of Christ, but even the person of Christ. All the while imagining ourselves to be doing so under the guise of intellectual superiority. What's so amazing is that as revolting as that must be to you, it does not deter you in the least from your pursuit and love of everyone, even the skeptic, even Nathanael, even me. We thank you that you came and lived as one of us. The Word became flesh and lived among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. Maybe you've been a Nathanael, maybe all your life. But maybe even just recently, God has been speaking to you, opening your eyes, opening your heart, opening your mind to the claims of Christ. That he loves you. And he came to die on the cross for your sin. Will you accept his gift? Or will you dismiss it? Those are your 2 options. Will you follow him or dismiss him? It's one or the other. Real life follows in following him. An encounter with Jesus.